Good morning. Today is the 26th day of September 2017, and we are continuing with our series, Poetry for the Soul. As you already know from our website, motherandshriaurobindo.in, and my YouTube site, Richard Eggenberger, there are two other series, Fine Poetry and Seeking the New Poetry. So Poetry for the Soul, our third series, is composed of quotations from poets, artists, writers, from all ages. Yesterday we did about 40 quotes, and today we will do about the same. So we begin. Ink runs from the corners of my mouth. There is no happiness like mine. I have been eating poetry. Mark Strand. So, poetry is something more philosophical and more worthy of serious attention than history. Aristotle. More and more, mankind will discover that we have to turn to poetry to interpret life for us, to console us, to sustain us. Without poetry, our science will appear incomplete, and most of what now passes with us for religion and philosophy will be replaced by poetry. Matthew Arnold. Hear the voice of the bard, who present, past, and future sees. William Blake. To give a sense of the freshness or vividness of life is a valid purpose for poetry. Wallace Stevens. It seems to me that all poets' precepts about the nature of poetry are true, even when they seem to contradict each other. Geoffrey Grigson. Poetry is the opening and closing of a door, leaving those who look through to guess about what is seen during a moment. Carl Sandburg. Poetry is a pheasant disappearing in the brush. Wallace Stevens. The poem, that prolonged hesitation between sound and sense. Paul Valéry. Poetry turns all things to loveliness. It marries exhilaration and horror, grief and pleasure, eternity and change. It subdues to union, under its light yoke, all irreconcilable differences. Percy Bysshe Shelley. The best poem is that whose worked upon, unmagical passages come closest in texture and intensity to the moments of magical accident. Dylan Thomas. Poetry is a response to the daily necessity of getting the world right. Wallace Stevens. Poetry has no role to play except beyond philosophy. André Breton. The crown of literature is poetry. It is its end and aim. It is the sublimest activity of the human mind. It is the achievement of beauty and delicacy. The writer of prose can only step aside when the poet passes. Somerset Maugham. Poetry is not a science, but an act of faith. Robert Graves. Poetry must resist the intelligence almost successfully. Wallace Stevens. Poetry heals the wounds inflicted by reason. Novalis. Poetry is the revelation of a feeling that the poet believes to be interior and personal, but which the reader recognizes as his own. Salvatore Quasimodo. And certainly, poetry is not the inculcation of morals or the direction of politics, and no more is it religion or an equivalent of religion, except by some monstrous abuse of words. T.S. Eliot. Poetry should be great and unobtrusive, a thing which enters into one's soul and does not startle it or amaze it with itself, but with its subject. John Keats. Poetry is life distilled. Gwendolyn Brooks. Poetry has been to me its own exceeding great reward. It has soothed my afflictions. It has multiplied and refined my enjoyments. It has endeared solitude. And it has given me the habit of wishing to discover the good and the beautiful in all that meets and surrounds me. Samuel Taylor Coleridge. It purges from our inward sight the film of familiarity, which obscures from us the wonder of our being. It compels us to feel that which we perceive and to imagine that which we know. Percy Bysshe Shelley. I think one of the greatest pleasures is to come across a poem that one can honestly like. It is like finding a new flower. James Russell Lowell. In poetry, you must love the words, the ideas, and the images and rhythms with all your capacity to love anything at all. Wallace Stevens. I can repeat poetry as well as other folk, if it comes to that. Oh, it needn't come to that, Alice hastily said. Lewis Carroll. Poetry comes fine-spun from a mind at peace. Ovid. No bad man can be a good poet. Boris Pasternak. God is the perfect poet, who in his person acts his own creations. Robert Browning. Here's a definition by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Prose, words in their best order. Poetry, the best words in the best order. And another one from Coleridge. Poetry is certainly something more than good sense, but it must be good sense at all events. Just as a palace is more than a house, but it must be a house at least. Poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. Everything you invent is true. You can be sure of that. Poetry is a subject as precise as geometry. Gustave Flaubert. Poetry is what is lost in translation. It is also what is lost in interpretation. Robert Frost. Great poetry is always written by somebody straining to go beyond what he can do. Stephen Spender. You will not find poetry anywhere unless you bring some of it with you. Joseph Joubert. Poetry is the universal art of the spirit, which has become free in itself, and which is not tied down for its realization to external, sensuous material. Instead, it launches out exclusively in the inner space and the inner time of ideas and feelings. G.W.F. Hegel. When many beauties grace a poem, I shall not take offense at a few faults. Horace.